Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. It's such an iconic book. It's a Hugo and Nebula Award winner. I think it got one of them the year it was published and one the year after. Probably Hugo the year it was published. You can't really talk about, well, I can't really talk about my own response to it, which was that it was an awe-inspiring piece of storytelling, by the way, without talking about its history. So Ender's Game started as a novelette in the 70s, which is when it was copyrighted, as I understand it, and then it was expanded, and I think Orson Scott Card did an amazing job of expanding it seamlessly. There are separate sections to this book. There's certainly Ender as a child on Earth, then there's Ender going to battle school as a launchie, and then so you can see stages to the book, but realistically speaking, it comes across as a single book. It doesn't stop and start as many novellas or short stories that we expanded do. I think it's pretty seamless. Now, it was released as a novel in 1985, I believe, according to the internet things that I've seen. Speaker for the Dead, I read more recently than this, much more recently. I think I originally read this one, it would have been back in the late 80s. And I enjoyed it, but I didn't own it, so I never got to reread it. Speaker for the Dead, whew, I still have it. I've reread this more recently, maybe half a dozen years ago. Thank you, Marcus, if you're watching, for sending it to me. I really enjoyed it, and now I can't wait to go straight onto this. Despite my major book haul of the month, 170 books still await my attention, but I'm bypassing all of them. Ender's Game was from that haul, by the way, but I'm bypassing all the others to go straight to the Speaker of the Dead because I can't imagine not continuing straight on. Now, Ender's Game. There are now apparently 16 other novels, I believe, that some of them are spin-offs of other characters in the book that went off to have their own series. There's a movie, there's the Inevitable comics, which I haven't gone near. They might be good, but yeah, I haven't gone near them. The movie, I believe, was pretty good. I think it's become a little bit of a cult classic, though it was described as being disappointing in the box office and is considered not a financial success. It was always hard for me to imagine a movie doing what this book did, because part of what makes this book iconic is that when it starts, Ender is being trained to be a battle commander and he's 6 years old. So that incredibly intelligent, very unusual child element, which is part of what makes Ender's Game so significant, is something that they decided not to do in the movie, and I believe that they had to do that. I don't see how you could make this novel work with 6-year-old child stars. There's too much that is really controversial about Ender's treatment. So I did actually mean to watch the movie. It wasn't in the cinemas for very long. I think I was going to the Indooroopilly cinemas back then. It appeared and it was gone within a week. Well, that's what it seemed like to me. One day I go, oh yeah, cheap cinema day, I'll go and watch Ender's Game. And not only was it gone, it had been gone for ages. So yeah, maybe one day. Probably not. I read far more than I watch. Okay, so I think it challenges a lot of basic human concepts in the book, and I think it probably did so even more back in the 70s and 80s, though probably the concepts that were more dodgy or more thoroughly challenged in the 70s are different to the ones that we have challenged today. For example, this is probably the only example I'm going to give. We've got a world with regulated births in this book. The entire political, social structure of the world is in large political blocks in a way that wasn't current or accurate for the 70s or the 80s, and certainly isn't current or accurate for today, where, if anything, they're breaking down a bit more. Especially Russia, who is still considered a major player in a book written in the 70s and the 80s. But worldwide, you have regulated births. So this must be agreement between the different political organizations. 2 per couple is the standard, with couples apparently still being the standard family method in this book, which makes sense. Third is considered a pejorative because it implies that your parents have already had 2 children, which are the allocated number of children. Now, in Ender's case, never mind. So that would be less controversial today than it was then. We've had the Chinese controlled breeding policy, and it's certainly been mooted in other ways by other people. So I don't think that would be as controversial today, and it's certainly been done in plenty of other novels since. Orson Scott Card's use of such a very young child in such violent and emotionally manipulative ways was, and I believe remains, controversial. So the story. I imagine that many people watching this have actually read it. Maybe like me, you read it a long time ago and you don't remember it too well. If you're considering reading it, I'd say just go for it and don't worry about my interpretation of the story. Just go and read it. I do not think spoilers are relevant to a book that was written so long ago. So we've got an Earth in this book that was attacked by an insectoid species about 50 years ago. I think in subsequent novels, or maybe in the movie, they get called Formica after Forma. Is that Latin for ants? Not sure. Anyway, they're insectoid. They are known to have a hive mind, which is regulated by a single queen, hence their communication, writing, etc. is not developed in them, though their space travel is. Now, this attack took place around 50 years before the book starts, and the main political parties, which are all apparently cooperating since they share the battle station and a few other space stations. They're cooperating in finding soldiers and generals to lead and command an army which will repel the aliens on their next invasion, which will be the third invasion. The feeling that we're given in the beginning, and as it's presented to Ender Wiggins, is that last invasion will be critical. They've had 50 years to prepare, but so have the aliens, commonly called buggers in this. I don't know that there are more respectable names ever given in this entire novel. So there's a lot of concern among the political parties and the battle parties as what's going to happen. They feel that they need a commander. The commander who managed to repel the aliens in the first and second is old. They need a new one. And this is part of this ongoing checking of children. They apparently strap something to the back of their neck which monitors their thoughts, their feelings, everything they do. I don't know. It monitors them in some way. Ender Wiggins' parents had been asked by the government to have a third child, that's Ender. So he is third, which, like I said, that's practically a swear word in this future world. The first two had qualified for monitoring, but they'd fallen out. So at some stage the box was removed and they were no longer considered eligible for battle school. The eldest, Peter, was considered too much of a sadistic psychopath, and the second child, Valentine, it's implied, was not aggressive enough. So the government's hoped that by having Ender, whose real name is Andrew's parents have a third child, he might be a perfect combination of the two. Now, as children, Ender and Valentine are close, and we see them trying to survive Peter's cruelty and violence by supporting each other as well as loving each other. Now, Peter's cruelty and lessons, as Ender calls them, are instrumental to him surviving several points after he goes to battle school, and his theme of "thank you, Peter, for teaching me this lesson" is both bitter and fascinating in several points. Now, probably part of the reason why this book appeals to some of us so very much is if we were not one of the crowd at school, if we did suffer ostracism or cruelty, if you did know that if you did well at something that you were good at, you were going to be bullied, anyone who's had that is going to emphasize to a certain degree with Ender's Game. And I feel that a lot of science fiction readers, certainly back in the 80s and 90s, fit into that. It's less controversial now, but if you liked science fiction back in the 80s, you were automatically I don't know, stereotyped, I suppose. Anyway, so Orson Scott Card doesn't really develop Ender's experiences at home and with his siblings extensively before he gets sent to battle school. But we do have about 30 odd pages to develop the character of Ender, and we do that mostly from inside his head. So we learn that he's solution bent, that he's highly empathetic, but being small and gifted and standing out, the bullying that he expects is significant. So in these early pages, we get to witness his solution to a bully gang targeting him at school. He's just had his monitor taken off. The bullies believe, though I don't understand how anyone can be that naive to believe that they're no longer being observed because his monitor is off. So they gang up to beat him up in the corridor outside class. Ender takes care of that on his own in a pretty brutal way. And I suppose people who don't like violence in the novels aren't going to like this particularly. And I suppose many people went to nice, safe schools. I didn't. The validation of the attack, in fact, which is not only to stop that attack from happening, but to make sure that no more ever happen. Do something so dramatic that anyone will always think twice before bullying you again. That's Ender's explanation for it. When a military personnel turns up at his school, at his home, at dinner time, say what you did to that child, kicking him when he was down, did you have to do that? And Ender is described from the inside as being terrified, but still honest, and he explains that he was making sure that further attacks never happened. These explanations, the reasons for the attack, rather than the actual attack, end up with Ender being taken to battle school. Now, Ender's fear, shame, and the deep morality that he exhibits while doing violent things, which I personally think is as exceptional in a young child as the intellect is, these things give a depth and a poignancy to all the actions that could be written as reprehensible. Orson Scott Card uses Peter as a dark mirror to Ender, who has the great empathy, allowing him to understand others, including bullies, and see solutions as they're needed, whereas Peter is portrayed in enjoying the violence and the solutions for themselves and creating those opportunities if they don't otherwise exist. So there's a lot of morality there. Now, Ender doesn't really want to go to battle school, but he is coerced and manipulated into doing so, and the coercion and the manipulation continue throughout. Adults working in concert to isolate, dehumanize, and force feed the children, but most particularly Ender, because it's his point of view, into being war machines. All of that's morally questionable, but I think Orson Scott Card does a great job of showcasing the mindsets and the belief patterns in the humans, the adult humans that is, that justify doing things that are essentially unjustifiable to children who really should be deserving of our love, support, and encouragement. Now, the ending further highlights that what human compartmentalization allows us to do inhumane and inhuman things, and the justifications for doing that, which people often in military positions will use. It's like the good of the all over the good of the single. Ethics, humanities, etc., etc. Philosophy. I was never that much into philosophy. As I get older, I get more interested in it, but yeah. Right, so Battle School is amazing, and it's a fairly large part of what is a large book, though it doesn't feel it. I didn't feel in the least bit at any point as if I didn't want to pick this up. I never felt that I particularly wanted to put it down. The reading experience was rich and satisfying every moment. So Ender and another small launch full of children start out as launchies, just learning how to do things in zero gravity. And again, Ender is set up to be the victim by General Graf, one of the adults. He uses his intellect this time to nullify the threat that is offered by the bully and his gang. And then he slowly develops his position in the team. So all the chapters dealing with Battle School are very much enhanced by the opening paragraphs. that is the opening paragraph to each chapter or section, which is always a discussion in a different fonts type between the commanders and school leaders about Ender, his development, or his cohort. These conversations give the reader an outside perspective into how they are manipulating Ender, which is dramatic and consistent. And that's kind of important because Ender is smart and he knows that he's being manipulated and he knows that he's being isolated, and he slowly learns that adults aren't to be trusted at all. However, their perspective on what they're doing to him is really quite valuable to the reader. It helps make the adults not the enemy, which by the end of Battle School is what the children feel. They feel that adults are the enemy rather than the buggers. So it also gives us the feeling on the part of the adults and the commanders, the intense and pervasive fear that Ender will not be ready in time for the battle that has to happen. So they're working on the clock and they're worried about it. The school continuously pits Ender against his cohorts. His tactical abilities and his intellect combine with that isolation to mean that he is constantly evolving new scenarios in the battle room, and once he goes into actual battle teams, he's constantly being moved around, exposed to different people and developing different strategies, but he keeps on winning and getting better and better. Even though his friends are constantly being torn away from him, he continues to make friends and he continues to have some people respect him, but at the same time he makes desperate enemies of others. Now his inner worlds, his doubts and uncertainties are all represented by a game that he plays during free time. Free time is when they can do whatever they like. A lot of the time Ender continues doing battle scenarios, but occasionally he goes and plays what's essentially a quest style computer game, and that computer game becomes stranger and stranger as he passes the areas that the commanders knew about, and he starts going into territory they know nothing about. At one point his brother Peter appears in his game, and the commanders are worried about the fact that the Peter in the game is not the Peter that Ender remembers. He's the Peter of today on Earth. They've got no idea how that happened. So, as well as being manipulated, Ender continues to be a wild card. Now, when Ender's 10 years old, he's promoted to command school after some pretty heavy stuff goes down, which you should read about because it's a great book and you should read it. Normally, you don't go from battle school straight to command school. You normally go into pre-command for a minimum of 2 years, but Ender goes straight to command school. By now, Orson Scott Card is doing a pretty masterly job of showing the slow unravelling of Ender's inner world, and that continues as he wins more battles. I know I'm skipping a little bit here in the middle, but yeah, we'll go on to command school. At command school, he is even more isolated because he's no longer in a cohort and he no longer sees other people. He's set against a whole heap of computer simulation battles, and when they become too simple for him, and he mentions that to Graf, he is given a personal teacher, an old man who turns out to be Mazer Rackham, who was the original commander for the first 2 bugger battles. He's the hero to the world, without whom they probably wouldn't have survived those battles. But he considers himself too old to lead another one. He becomes the mentor for Ender, and at this stage we start to see almost torture of Ender by Mazer, and slow but quite complete mental deterioration of Ender, who as a child has reached a point where his psyche is being thoroughly broken down by everything that's happening to him. And this is pretty harsh reading, really. It's still rich and it's still interesting, but it's harsh. Okay. So the simulations get harder and harder. Instead of routinely winning, now Ender loses quite a few units. He's reunited with several of the people he knew at battle school who have now made it to command, and he uses them for commanders in his simulations. Now one day Ender's taken into a room full of observer commanders. He by this stage is deep in, I suppose it's depression, but it's heading towards catatonia. He doesn't really want to do it anymore, but he's told that this will be his final test. The simulation is his graduation. So he goes along with it. Many of his friends from battle school are his commanders. This simulation is taking on a huge array of spaceships and battleships with the planet in the background. And with huge losses, he manages to destroy the planet using a method that's never been used before. At that point, he learns, that this wasn't a simulation, this was an actual battle. And that since Mazza has been his tutor, all his battles have been real. And at this point, he is worn out mentally and emotionally. He may be a hero to the human race, having saved them from the buggers, but he's done. He feels personally responsible for the genocide of an alien race. Oh. And his retreat from everything is where we catch up with a secondary thread that's been happening with his sister Valentine and his brother Peter. I don't think I'm going to talk about that thread too much. It's interesting. It uses two characters who are strong characters. It again questions heavily manipulation and self-autonomy, morality versus immorality, personal goals versus idealism, I suppose. But I don't think I really want to go into that. And at the end of it, we have a world where the social structures have collapsed due to the threat of the buggers no longer being there to unify them. And a whole heap of stuff is happening on Earth, but Ender can't return to Earth. There's too many people who want to use him, it wouldn't be safe, etc., etc. And eventually, his sister Valentine comes up to the space station that he's on, and the two of them join a group of space colonists. Ender doesn't really want to do anything. He's very null at this point, but Valentine talks him into doing this. It's 50 years away from Earth, so basically when you leave Earth, you leave everyone and everything behind. That's the end of it. They do have interstellar communications in this world, so you can still talk to Earth, but they go off and they settle a new world. The notion behind the colonists is that all the worlds that had previously been inhabited by the buggers, which were habitable by humans, are now standing empty because the buggers are gone. And on this new planet, Ender becomes a colony's governor, and slowly it settles into a kind of agrarian culture. He gets to develop his skills in ways that don't involve battle simulators, and it's almost peaceful. Now, at the end of this part, he finds that the buggers were actually in communication with his mind, but not having language or writing or anything like that, they had limited ways of doing so. So they left him essentially their version of a note. And at the end of the note is a queen egg that could bring the species back from the dead. So basically he would no longer be a genocide. The person who brought about the genocide of their race. It's very nuanced, and at this point, with his sister Valentine as the person who gets it out there, he writes The Hive Queen under the alias of Speaker for the Dead. And the Speaker for the Dead notion becomes pervasive throughout humanity, almost like a new religion, though it's not so much worshipping a god as allowing people to give the dead a voice. And it's an interesting concept that I personally really enjoy, and I do remember it's far, far more expanded, of course, in this not insignificant novel, which I will be starting before the end of the day. And the end of this book manages to be wistful and peaceful and comforting, which, considering that there's almost nothing comforting in the entire rest of this book, is really significantly impressive. I think it's a beautiful piece of writing from start to finish. I know not everyone loves this book. Back in the day, every science fiction writer seemed to like it. A lot of younger people don't. So a little bit, who will not like this book? I think some younger people won't. They're spoiled for choice. A lot of the concepts that I expounded here, they've encountered many times already. And probably the writing style isn't for everyone. If they're used to the young adult themes of today, there's a lot more richness, I keep using that word, wealth, depth, nuance to this writing than you're going to find in some books. Might not be for everything. Also, who else will not like it? Well, the nuanced exploration of morality versus necessity makes it, also I am told, recommended reading in several military organisations. I believe they're all American. This is a rather Americano-centric book in some ways. They're not others. However, that nuanced exploration of morality versus necessity, because there's a lot of necessity and a lot of violence, means that it's been criticised very heavily in all manner of ways. Some American journalists compared Ender to Hitler, which I feel was more because they wanted to achieve something in the eyes of their readers than they actually had a good case. There's other ones that have criticised the fact that while Ender commits genocide, he is represented as completely innocent. Ender himself does not consider himself innocent, so I'm not sure about that criticism. The book doesn't really weigh in on that, I don't think. Okay, there's also the criticism of children in the novel. I think that's effectively nullified by the fact that this criticism is explored within the book itself. Some people don't agree with me. Actual Graf, who was responsible for a lot of the things that were done to Ender, actually had extended court case at the end, we find. So it's not that treatment of children, poor treatment of children, has no repercussions. There are repercussions. Another strong criticism that I've found in the Goodread threads is apparently Orson Scott Card isn't a nice person. Some people claim he's homophobic. Some people claim he's misogynistic. Apparently a couple of people believe he's racist. I can't go with that one because he has inclusiveness of races. It's not extensive, but for the 70s or the 80s, it's kind of ahead of its time, so I'm not going with that. Okay, there aren't a lot of females in the book. I love Valentine, and one of the other battle leaders is female, Petra. But if you need books approved by the Bechdel test, don't even think of picking this one up. Not for you. Okay, I think this is one of the most vivid, beautiful, and fascinatingly immersive books. If you like reading about military matters, and if you enjoy some violence in your military discussions. There is a lot of violence, both overt and implicit, physical and emotional, and if you don't like violence of any kind in your books, not for you. Some people have also claimed that the plot is generic. I disagree. I don't think there was anything quite like it when it was published, and though military and violence in books are not uncommon and getting more and more common, there's plenty of new writers who've done excellent jobs with it. I think that the deeply engaging way of writing that Orson Scott Card has in Ender's Game was well deserving of the Hugo and Nebula Awards. And I personally feel that the morality questions in it might have been too nuanced for some mainstream writers who usually read mainstream fiction to understand were there. That's my feeling. I think it explored a lot of things that had not been previously explored, and at the end of the day, however you want to criticize the author, and I'm not into that. Rudyard Kipling is one of my favourite literary authors, and he was a neo-Nazi, for goodness sake. You don't get much worse than that. Whatever you think of the author, this is a beautiful book. Beautiful classic science fiction book, and I do thoroughly recommend it. And I want to do a shout out. Thank you, Marcus, for giving me Speaker of the Dead. Do you realise I still have your copy? It's been a while. I can give it back if you like, after I've read it again.